You're standing in the marble halls of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The year is 41 BC, and the morning sun filters through towering columns that reach toward the heavens like fingers of the gods themselves. The air is thick with incense and the whispered prayers of pilgrims who have traveled from across the Mediterranean to seek the goddess's blessing. This is sacred ground, a place where even the most hardened Roman soldiers remove their helmets and lower their voices in reverence. But today, something is different. You notice the tension in the air, the way the priestesses exchange worried glances, the unusual number of armed men lingering just outside the temple precinct. In the inner sanctuary, a young woman kneels before the altar of Artemis, her hands clasped in prayer. She is beautiful in the way that legends are made of. High cheekbones, dark eyes that hold both intelligence and desperation, and the unmistakable bearing of someone born to rule. This is Arsinoe IV, the last pharaoh of Egypt, though history has forgotten her name while elevating her sisters to immortality. She doesn't know it yet, but this will be her final dawn. In a few hours, soldiers will drag her from this sacred sanctuary and execute her on the very steps where pilgrims have prayed for centuries. The order comes not from some distant Roman senator or jealous rival, but from her own sister, Cleopatra VII, the most famous queen in history. And the man who will carry out this violation of divine law is Mark Antony, Cleopatra's lover and one of Rome's most powerful rulers. What you're about to witness isn't just another tale of ancient political intrigue. This is the story of how love, ambition, and the ruthless pursuit of power converged in one of history's most shocking acts of betrayal. It's the story of a sister who ordered her sibling's death, a Roman general who violated sacred law for his lover, and a young woman whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. Before diving into this forgotten chapter of ancient history, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of the past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the dramatic tales that shaped our world. To understand the full horror of what happened at the Temple of Artemis, we must first understand the twisted world of Ptolemaic Egypt, a kingdom where brothers married sisters, where assassination was a family tradition, and where the pursuit of power knew no bounds. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians but Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, who had carved out an empire in the rich Nile Delta after Alexander's death. For nearly 3 centuries, they had ruled Egypt through a combination of divine kingship, political cunning, and systematic brutality that would make even the most hardened Roman emperor blush. The Ptolemaic family tree wasn't so much a tree as it was a twisted vine choking itself in its own coils. Brothers routinely married sisters, uncles wed nieces, and cousins produced children who would inherit not just crowns, but the accumulated genetic damage of centuries of inbreeding. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate policy designed to keep the bloodline pure and prevent outsiders from claiming the throne. The first Ptolemaic sibling marriage was between Ptolemy II and his sister Arsinoe II, creating a template that would be followed for generations. They elevated themselves to the status of sibling gods, modeling themselves after Egyptian deities like Osiris and Isis, who were both siblings and spouses in Egyptian mythology. By the time Arsinoe IV was born, sometime between 68 and 63 BC, the Ptolemaic dynasty was already showing the devastating effects of this genetic isolation. Mental instability, physical deformities, and various health problems plagued the royal family. But more dangerous than any genetic defect was the political instability that came from having too many potential heirs, each with an equal claim to the throne. The Ptolemies had turned fratricide into an art form, brothers killing brothers, sisters poisoning sisters, children murdering parents to claim power. It was a system that guaranteed conflict and virtually ensured that each succession would be marked by civil war. Arsinoe was born into this world as the youngest daughter of Ptolemy XIII, known as Auletes, the flute player, a weak king who had spent much of his reign fighting to keep his throne with Roman support. Her siblings included the famous Cleopatra VII, who was about 5 years older, and 2 brothers, Ptolemy III and Ptolemy XIV, who would both eventually marry Cleopatra according to family tradition. From birth, Arsinoe understood that her family was both her greatest asset and her deadliest threat. In the Ptolemaic world, love and murder were often indistinguishable, and survival required a delicate balance of loyalty and ruthlessness. The palace where Arsinoe grew up in Alexandria was a marvel of the ancient world. The great library, the lighthouse of Alexandria, the royal quarters with their elaborate gardens and marble halls, it was a city that represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic civilization. But beneath the cultured veneer lay a brutal reality. Palace intrigue was not just politics, it was a matter of life and death. Children learned to watch for poison in their food, to read the subtle signs of shifting alliances, to understand that today's loyal advisor might be tomorrow's assassin. Arsinoe received the finest education available to a Ptolemaic princess. She learned to speak Greek, Egyptian, and Latin fluently. She studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy with the best tutors money could buy. She was trained in the arts of statecraft, learning to read people's motivations, to negotiate treaties, and to project the divine authority that was essential to Ptolemaic kingship. But perhaps most importantly, she learned the family business, how to survive in a world where your closest relatives were your most dangerous enemies. The education of a Ptolemaic princess was not just academic, but intensely practical. Arsinoe would have learned to identify poisons and their antidotes, to recognize the signs of approaching betrayal, and to maintain networks of loyal supporters who might warn her of danger. She studied the histories of her predecessors, learning from the mistakes of ancestors who had trusted too much or too little, who had moved too quickly or too slowly in the deadly game of royal politics. Every lesson was ultimately about survival in a world where weakness meant death. When Ptolemy XIII died in 51 BC, the succession should have been straightforward. According to his will, Cleopatra VII and her younger brother Ptolemy III were to rule jointly as husband and wife, following the ancient tradition. But nothing was ever straightforward in Ptolemaic Egypt. Cleopatra was intelligent, ambitious, and determined to rule alone rather than share power with her brother. Ptolemy XIII, though younger, had powerful advisors who believed they could control him more easily than his strong-willed sister. The stage was set for civil war, and Arsinoe found herself caught in the middle of a conflict that would ultimately determine not just who ruled Egypt, but whether Egypt would survive as an independent kingdom. The first phase of the conflict seemed to favor Ptolemy III. His advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, managed to drive Cleopatra from Alexandria by 49 BC. Cleopatra fled to Upper Egypt, then to Syria, where she began gathering an army to reclaim her throne. But the situation became exponentially more complicated when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, pursuing his rival Pompey after the Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar's arrival transformed what had been a local civil war into a conflict with global implications. Cleopatra famously smuggled herself into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet or bed linens, and immediately began working to seduce both the man and his political support. She understood that Roman backing was essential to her survival, and she was willing to use every weapon at her disposal, beauty, intelligence, charm, and the vast wealth of Egypt to secure that support. Caesar, for his part, was attracted not just to Cleopatra's legendary beauty, but to her obvious intelligence and the strategic value of Egyptian alliance. Their relationship was both genuinely passionate and coldly calculating, a perfect example of how personal and political motivations were inseparable in the ancient world. It was during this period that Arsinoe first emerges as a major player in the historical record. Initially, she appears to have supported Cleopatra, accompanying her sister during her exile from Alexandria. But whether this support was genuine or forced remains unclear. Some sources suggest that Arsinoe went willingly, believing in Cleopatra's cause. Others hint that she was taken as a hostage, insurance against any attempt at independent action. Given the paranoid nature of Ptolemaic politics, the latter explanation seems more likely. Cleopatra would have understood that leaving any potential rival free to act independently was an invitation to betrayal. When Caesar declared that Ptolemy III and Cleopatra should rule jointly according to their father's will, all the potential heirs were brought to the palace in Alexandria and kept under armed guard. This wasn't protection, it was house arrest. Caesar understood the volatile nature of Ptolemaic succession and was determined to prevent any of the siblings from taking independent action that might threaten his plans for Egypt. But keeping ambitious royals confined was like trying to contain lightning in a bottle. The pressure was bound to explode eventually. The explosion came when Arsinoe managed to escape from the palace with her mentor, the eunuch Ganymedes. This wasn't just a flight to safety, it was a bold political statement. By escaping, Arsinoe was declaring her independence from both Caesar's authority and her siblings' claims. More dramatically, she immediately proclaimed herself Queen Arsinoe IV, establishing a rival court and beginning to gather military support. At approximately 17 years old, she was making a bid for sole rule of Egypt, challenging not just her siblings but the most powerful Roman of his generation. The audacity of Arsinoe's move cannot be overstated. She was a teenage girl taking on Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the man who had crossed the Rubicon and brought Rome to its knees. She had no significant military experience, no established power base, and no foreign allies. What she had was burning ambition, remarkable intelligence, and a profound understanding of Egyptian politics. She also had something her siblings lacked, the ability to present herself as a truly independent Egyptian ruler, free from Roman influence and committed to restoring Egypt's ancient glory. Arsinoe's first act as self-proclaimed queen was to eliminate potential rivals within her own camp. She ordered the execution of Achilles, the general who had initially supported Ptolemy III but had joined her cause. This wasn't mere cruelty, it was a calculated demonstration of her authority and a warning to others who might consider betraying her. By killing Achilles, she was announcing that she would not be a puppet ruler controlled by ambitious advisors. She intended to rule in her own right, making her own decisions and accepting responsibility for their consequences. Under Arsinoe's leadership, the Egyptian resistance enjoyed remarkable success against Caesar's forces. The Romans found themselves trapped in a section of Alexandria, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Arsinoe's forces built walls across the streets, flooded the cisterns that supplied Caesar's troops with fresh water, and maintained a siege that brought the future dictator of Rome to the brink of defeat. For months, the outcome hung in the balance. Caesar, who had conquered armies across Europe, found himself outmaneuvered by a teenager who had never commanded troops before. The military genius that Arsinoe displayed during the siege of Alexandria was nothing short of extraordinary. While Caesar had expected to deal with a fractured Egyptian resistance led by squabbling advisors, he instead found himself facing a unified force under the command of someone who understood both the psychology of warfare and the tactical advantages of fighting on home ground. Arsinoe's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. She didn't try to match Rome's military might head-on. Instead, she used Alexandria's urban landscape as a weapon, turning the city's narrow streets into death traps and its complex water systems into instruments of siege warfare. The flooding of Caesar's cisterns was particularly devastating. Roman armies were accustomed to establishing secure supply lines and reliable sources of fresh water. By releasing seawater into the underground channels that supplied the Roman quarter, Arsinoe forced Caesar's troops to ration their water while simultaneously dealing with the psychological pressure of being trapped in an increasingly hostile city. The Romans, who prided themselves on their engineering prowess, found themselves outmaneuvered by an opponent who knew every hidden passage and secret tunnel in the ancient city. But perhaps most impressively, Arsinoe managed to maintain discipline and loyalty among her forces during the siege. Egyptian armies had a reputation for being unreliable, prone to desertion when facing Roman legions. Under Arsinoe's leadership, however, they fought with a determination that surprised even seasoned Roman officers. She had somehow convinced her soldiers that they were fighting, not just for another Ptolemaic ruler, but for Egyptian independence itself. This wasn't merely about dynastic succession. It was about whether Egypt would remain a sovereign kingdom or become another Roman province. The siege might have succeeded if not for the arrival of Roman reinforcements, and more crucially, the betrayal of Arsinoe's own troops. In one of history's most tragic reversals, the Egyptian soldiers who had fought so bravely for their young queen suddenly turned against her. They negotiated directly with Caesar, offering to exchange Arsinoe for the release of Ptolemy XIII. The exact reasons for this betrayal remain unclear, but it likely involved a combination of Roman gold, promises of better treatment, and the simple exhaustion that comes from prolonged siege warfare. When Arsinoe learned of her soldiers' treachery, she faced a choice that would define her character for posterity. She could have tried to escape, disappearing into the vast Egyptian countryside where loyal supporters might have hidden her. She could have attempted to negotiate her own terms with Caesar, perhaps offering to renounce her claim to the throne in exchange for exile. Instead, she chose to face her fate with the dignity befitting a pharaoh. She allowed herself to be taken prisoner, understanding that her capture would mean the end of Egyptian resistance, but refusing to abandon the troops who had followed her, even as they abandoned her. Caesar's victory in Alexandria was complete, but it came at a cost that would haunt him for years. Ptolemy III was found floating dead in the Nile. Whether by accident, suicide, or murder, remains one of history's mysteries. Cleopatra was restored to her throne, now ruling alone but clearly as a Roman client. And Arsinoe, the teenager who had brought the future master of Rome to the brink of defeat, was loaded onto a ship bound for Italy, where she would face a fate designed to break her spirit before it ended her life. The journey to Rome was a nightmare of humiliation and uncertainty. Arsinoe was chained in the ship's hold, treated not as a captured queen, but as a common prisoner. The conditions were deliberately harsh: barely adequate food, no privacy, and the constant company of Roman guards who delighted in reminding her of her fallen status. For someone who had grown up in the luxury of the Alexandrian palace, who had been educated to believe in her divine right to rule, the physical degradation was almost unbearable. But the psychological torture was worse than the physical discomfort. Arsinoe spent the long voyage knowing that she was being transported to Rome for Caesar's triumph, a public spectacle where she would be paraded before the Roman mob as a symbol of their victory over Egypt. She had seen enough Roman triumphs to know what awaited her. Captured enemies were displayed like exotic animals, forced to walk in chains behind the victorious general's chariot, while crowds jeered and threw refuse. Many prisoners were strangled at the conclusion of the ceremony, their deaths serving as the final punctuation mark on Rome's victory. The triumph of 46 BC was one of the most magnificent spectacles in Roman history. Caesar celebrated not just his victory in Egypt, but his conquests in Gaul, his defeat of Pompey, and his victories in Africa. The procession stretched for miles through the streets of Rome, featuring captured treasure, exotic animals, elaborate floats depicting scenes from Caesar's campaigns, and hundreds of prisoners from across the Mediterranean world. The Roman people, who had endured years of civil war and economic hardship, were dazzled by the display of wealth and power. When Arsinoe appeared in the procession, bound in golden chains and forced to walk behind a burning effigy of the lighthouse of Alexandria, something unexpected happened. The Roman crowd, which had been cheering and celebrating, fell silent. Here was a young woman, barely out of her teens, who carried herself with such dignity despite her circumstances that even the bloodthirsty Roman mob felt a stirring of sympathy. She didn't weep or plead or show any sign of the fear that must have been consuming her. Instead, she walked with her head high, her expression composed, looking every inch the queen she claimed to be. The reaction of the crowd was unprecedented. Romans prided themselves on their hardness, their ability to watch suffering without flinching. But something about Arsinoe's bearing, her youth, and perhaps her obvious courage in the face of certain death, touched even their callous hearts. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. "She's just a child. Look how brave she is. This isn't right." The murmurs grew louder, more insistent, until they became a chorus of voices calling for mercy. Caesar found himself in an impossible position. Roman tradition demanded that enemy leaders be executed at the conclusion of a triumph. The crowd expected it, the gods required it, and his own political position depended on projecting strength and ruthlessness. But the same crowd that expected blood was now demanding mercy, and Caesar was politician enough to understand that executing a young woman who had won the people's sympathy could damage his reputation for clemency, a reputation he was carefully cultivating as part of his transformation from military commander to political leader. The solution Caesar chose was both politically brilliant and ultimately tragic. Instead of executing Arsinoe, he announced that she would be granted sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. This decision appeared merciful while actually serving Caesar's interests perfectly. By sparing her life, he demonstrated his magnanimity to the Roman people. By confining her to a temple, he removed her from politics, while making it impossible for her to marry and produce heirs who might challenge Egyptian succession. And by choosing the Temple of Artemis, he was placing her in a location that was both prestigious enough to satisfy her royal dignity and remote enough to prevent her from becoming a focal point for anti-Roman sentiment. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was indeed a fitting prison for a fallen queen. Built by King Croesus of Lydia around 550 BC and rebuilt after being destroyed by the madman Herostratus in 356 BC, it was one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. The temple was over 350 feet long and 180 feet wide, double the size of the Parthenon, with 127 columns that reached toward the heavens like a forest of marble trees. The building was adorned with sculptures by the greatest artists of the age, and its treasury contained offerings from kings and emperors across the known world. But the temple was more than just an architectural marvel. It was a place where the ancient world's understanding of the divine intersected with political reality. The Artemis worshipped at Ephesus was not quite the same as the Greek goddess of the hunt known elsewhere. This was a fertility goddess, her chest draped with symbols of abundance, her crown depicting the walls of the city she protected. She was a mother goddess, a protector of women, and a symbol of the life-giving forces that sustained civilization. The irony of confining Arsinoe, a woman whose only crime was seeking to give life to Egyptian independence, in the temple of such a goddess, would not have been lost on ancient observers. The city of Ephesus itself was one of the most important ports in the ancient world, a cosmopolitan center where Greek culture, Roman administration, and ancient Anatolian traditions blended into something unique. Merchants from across the Mediterranean brought goods and ideas to its markets. Scholars debated philosophy in its academies. Pilgrims from distant lands sought healing and wisdom at its temples. For someone like Arsinoe, who had grown up in the similarly cosmopolitan atmosphere of Alexandria, Ephesus offered at least the comfort of cultural sophistication. As a priestess of Artemis, Arsinoe was granted a position of considerable honor within the temple hierarchy. She was not imprisoned in the conventional sense. She could move freely within the sacred precinct, participate in religious ceremonies, and even receive visitors from the outside world. The role of priestess was intended to prevent her from claiming political power, as religious service was supposed to be incompatible with secular rule. But it also provided her with a platform from which to maintain her dignity and, perhaps more dangerously from Cleopatra's perspective, to continue projecting the image of a legitimate alternative to Egyptian rule. The years Arsinoe spent at the Temple of Artemis were marked by a strange kind of suspended animation. She was alive but politically dead, free but confined, honored but powerless. She participated in the daily rituals of the temple, learned the ancient hymns and ceremonies, and gradually became an integral part of the religious community. But she also maintained correspondence with supporters in Egypt and across the Mediterranean, keeping herself informed of political developments and ensuring that her name remained alive in the consciousness of those who might one day seek an alternative to Cleopatra's rule. The high priest Megabyzus, who oversaw the temple's operations, apparently saw in Arsinoe not just another priestess, but a figure of genuine political significance. In a move that would prove fatally dangerous, he began addressing her as queen during certain ceremonies, acknowledging her royal status despite her religious role. This wasn't mere courtesy. It was a political statement that recognized Arsinoe's continuing claim to the Egyptian throne and implicitly criticized Cleopatra's rule. Word of these developments inevitably reached Alexandria, where Cleopatra was struggling to maintain her position as Queen of Egypt and mistress of Julius Caesar. The relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar was both passionate and pragmatic. She genuinely cared for the Roman general, but she also understood that her survival depended on maintaining his support. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Cleopatra found herself suddenly vulnerable, her primary protector dead, and her position in Egypt dependent on the goodwill of whoever emerged victorious from the civil war that would inevitably follow. The death of Julius Caesar plunged the Roman world into chaos. The triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus represented an uneasy alliance of ambitious men who had temporarily united to defeat Caesar's assassins, but who were bound to turn on each other eventually. For Cleopatra, this situation presented both opportunity and danger. She needed to choose the right Roman patron, but choosing wrong could mean the end of her reign and possibly her life. Mark Antony emerged as the most likely candidate for Cleopatra's support. As the ruler of Rome's eastern provinces, he controlled the territories closest to Egypt and had the most direct interest in Egyptian affairs. He was also, by all accounts, a man of enormous personal magnetism, handsome, charismatic, and possessed of the kind of larger-than-life personality that appealed to someone like Cleopatra, who had grown up believing in the divine nature of kingship. The famous meeting between Antony and Cleopatra at Tarsus in 41 BC has been romanticized by countless writers and artists, but the reality was more complex than the popular image suggests. Cleopatra arrived aboard a magnificent ship, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants costumed as cupids and sea nymphs. The spectacle was breathtaking, but it was also a carefully calculated political statement. Cleopatra was presenting herself not just as a beautiful woman, but as the living embodiment of divine power, a queen whose alliance would bring both earthly wealth and heavenly favor. Antony was immediately captivated, but not in the way that Hollywood would have us believe. This wasn't love at first sight, it was recognition at first sight. Two master manipulators recognizing each other across the political chessboard, understanding that their destinies were now intertwined. Antony needed Egypt's vast wealth to fund his ambitions in the East. Cleopatra needed Roman military power to secure her throne against both internal rivals and external threats. What began as a strategic alliance would evolve into something deeper, but it was always fundamentally about power. The winter that Antony and Cleopatra spent together in Alexandria was a whirlwind of luxury, passion, and political calculation. They hunted together in the Egyptian desert, feasted on delicacies from across the Mediterranean, and conceived the first of their 3 children. But even as they reveled in their newfound partnership, the specter of Arsinoe haunted their relationship. Cleopatra could not forget that somewhere in Ephesus, her sister maintained a rival court, accepted the title of queen, and represented a constant threat to her legitimacy. The reports that reached Alexandria about Arsinoe's activities at the Temple of Artemis were deeply troubling to Cleopatra. It wasn't just that the high priest Megabyzus was addressing her as queen, though that was inflammatory enough. It was that Arsinoe had apparently begun to attract a following among the temple's visitors, many of whom were merchants, diplomats, and travelers who had connections throughout the eastern Mediterranean. These people carried stories back to their home cities, spreading word that there was an alternative to Cleopatra's rule, a Ptolemaic princess who had never compromised with Rome and who represented a purer form of Egyptian sovereignty. Even more dangerous were the whispers that Arsinoe would make a better queen than her sister. These criticisms weren't just personal, they were political dynamite. Cleopatra's rule was increasingly dependent on Roman support, and many Egyptians resented the growing influence of foreign advisors and the tribute payments that flowed from Alexandria to Rome. Arsinoe, by contrast, was remembered as the queen who had fought Caesar to a standstill, who had chosen Egyptian independence over Roman accommodation, and who had paid the price for her principles. The psychological pressure on Cleopatra was enormous. She had spent years establishing herself as the legitimate ruler of Egypt, the worthy heir to the great pharaohs of the past. But legitimacy in the ancient world was never secure. It had to be constantly defended, constantly reinforced, constantly protected against rivals and pretenders. As long as Arsinoe lived, she represented a walking contradiction to Cleopatra's narrative of inevitable rule. She was proof that there had been alternatives, that different choices could have been made, that Cleopatra's path was not the only possible one. The situation became more urgent as Antony's political position in Rome began to deteriorate. His rival Octavian was systematically undermining his reputation, portraying him as a man who had gone native in the East, who had been corrupted by foreign luxury and feminine influence. Every story about Antony's relationship with Cleopatra was used as evidence of his unfitness for Roman leadership. In this context, any suggestion that Cleopatra herself was not the unquestioned ruler of Egypt could be catastrophic for both their reputations. Cleopatra understood that she needed to act decisively. As long as Arsinoe lived, she would remain a potential focal point for opposition to Cleopatra's rule. She would continue to attract supporters who dreamed of a different kind of Egyptian independence. She would serve as a constant reminder that Cleopatra's power depended on Roman support rather than Egyptian loyalty. Most dangerously, she would remain available as an alternative if Cleopatra's relationship with Antony ever soured, or if Roman politics shifted in ways that made a change in Egyptian leadership advantageous. The decision to eliminate Arsinoe was not made in a moment of passion or jealousy. It was a calculated political move, arrived at through careful consideration of all the factors that threatened Cleopatra's position. She had learned from her father's example that survival in the Ptolemaic world required ruthless decisiveness. Hesitation was weakness, and weakness was death. If she was to secure her throne for herself and her children, she could not afford to leave potential rivals alive to challenge her authority. The conversation between Cleopatra and Antony about Arsinoe's fate probably took place in the royal palace in Alexandria, perhaps in the same chambers where Cleopatra had once entertained Julius Caesar. The setting would have been magnificent. Marble floors inlaid with precious stones, walls decorated with frescoes depicting the gods of Egypt and Greece, windows overlooking the harbor where the lighthouse of Alexandria cast its beacon across the Mediterranean. But the beauty of the surroundings would have been overshadowed by the grimness of the discussion. Cleopatra would have presented her case with the same strategic intelligence that had made her one of the most successful rulers of her age. She would have explained how Arsinoe's continued existence threatened not just her own position, but the entire Roman-Egyptian alliance that was central to Antony's eastern strategy. She would have pointed out that the high priest's recognition of Arsinoe as queen was tantamount to a declaration of independence from Roman authority. She would have argued that allowing this challenge to go unanswered would encourage other rivals and pretenders throughout the region. Antony's response reveals much about his character and his political priorities. He was not a man given to unnecessary cruelty. His reputation for generosity and magnanimity was well established, but he was also intensely practical when it came to maintaining power. He understood that his relationship with Cleopatra was not just personal but political, and that her enemies were necessarily his enemies. More importantly, he recognized that any threat to Cleopatra's legitimacy was a threat to the stability of the Eastern Mediterranean, which was his responsibility as a member of the triumvirate. The decision to violate the sanctuary of the Temple of Artemis was not made lightly. Both Cleopatra and Antony understood the religious and political implications of such an act. Temples were supposed to be inviolable, places where even the most hardened criminals could find safety from their enemies. The gods themselves were believed to protect those who sought sanctuary in their sacred precincts. To violate this protection was to risk divine wrath and human condemnation. But political necessity overrode religious scruple. Antony calculated that the immediate benefits of eliminating Arsinoe outweighed the long-term costs of violating temple sanctuary. He was confident in his military power and his political position. He believed that any criticism of his actions could be managed through the usual combination of propaganda, intimidation, and bribery that characterized Roman politics. He was wrong about the lasting damage to his reputation, but in the short term his assessment proved correct. The orders went out from Alexandria with characteristic Roman efficiency. Antony's agents were experienced in such matters. The elimination of political rivals was a routine part of Roman governance, and the triumvirate had already executed hundreds of enemies during their rise to power. But this assignment was different. The target was a woman, a former queen, and someone who had already demonstrated remarkable courage and dignity in the face of adversity. Moreover, she was protected by religious sanctuary in one of the most sacred places in the ancient world. The agents who received these orders understood that they were being asked to commit an act that would shock the ancient world. They were soldiers, accustomed to killing in battle and executing enemies of the state. But this was different. This was the violation of everything that civilized people held sacred. Yet they also understood that refusing such orders would mean their own deaths. In the world of Roman politics, loyalty to one's patron was absolute, and questioning orders was tantamount to treason. The journey from Alexandria to Ephesus gave the assassins time to contemplate what they were about to do. They traveled by ship across the eastern Mediterranean, through waters that had been sailed by heroes and gods in the ancient myths. They passed islands where temples to various deities dotted the coastlines, each one a reminder of the religious traditions they were about to violate. They knew that their actions would be remembered long after their own names were forgotten, but they also knew that they had no choice but to carry out their orders. Meanwhile, in the Temple of Artemis, Arsinoe continued her daily routine, unaware that her death warrant had already been signed. She participated in the morning prayers, helped prepare offerings for the goddess, and received visitors who came seeking the wisdom and blessing of the temple. Some of these visitors were merchants and diplomats who brought news from across the Mediterranean. Others were scholars and philosophers who valued the temple's reputation as a center of learning. A few were Egyptian exiles who still dreamed of a different kind of future for their homeland. The high priest Megabyzus had become genuinely fond of Arsinoe during her years at the temple. He was an old man, someone who had spent decades serving the goddess, and observing the political machinations of the outside world with the detached wisdom that comes from religious contemplation. He had seen many powerful people rise and fall, had witnessed the endless cycle of ambition and destruction that characterized ancient politics. But there was something different about Arsinoe, a quality of dignity and grace that transcended her political circumstances. In their conversations, Megabyzus had come to understand that Arsinoe's claim to queenship was not based on mere ambition, but on a genuine sense of duty to her people. She spoke of Egypt not as a possession to be exploited, but as a sacred trust to be protected. She dreamed of a future where Egyptians could govern themselves according to their own traditions, free from foreign interference and internal strife. Her vision was probably naive. The world of the 1st century BC was too complex and interconnected for such simple solutions. But her sincerity was undeniable, and it had earned her the respect of everyone who knew her. The signs that something was wrong began to appear several days before the actual assassination. Visitors to the temple noticed an unusual number of strangers in the city, men with the bearing of soldiers who claimed to be merchants or pilgrims. The temple guards reported seeing people watching the sacred precinct from a distance, as if studying the layout and routines. Local officials received inquiries about Arsinoe's daily schedule, questions that seemed innocent but felt somehow threatening. Megabyzus, with the instincts of someone who had survived decades of political upheaval, began to sense danger. He increased the number of guards around the temple, varied the times of religious ceremonies, and quietly warned Arsinoe that she might be in danger. But there was little he could do to protect her against a determined assassination attempt. The temple's sanctuary was both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It was supposed to be inviolable, but that very assumption made it vulnerable to those who were willing to violate sacred law. On the morning of the assassination, Arsinoe rose early to participate in the dawn prayers to Artemis. It was a ritual she had performed hundreds of times during her years at the temple, but this morning felt different. The air was thick with tension, and even the birds seemed to sense that something was wrong. The usual crowd of worshippers was smaller than normal, and those who were present seemed nervous and distracted. As Arsinoe knelt before the altar of Artemis, her hands clasped in prayer, she may have sensed that this would be her final communion with the goddess who had protected her for so long. The marble altar was stained with the blood of countless sacrifices, offerings made by pilgrims seeking favor, protection, or forgiveness. Soon it would be stained with different blood, the blood of a woman whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The assassins entered the temple just as the morning ceremonies were concluding. They were dressed as Roman officials, carrying documents that they claimed gave them authority to arrest Arsinoe on charges of treason against the Roman state. The temple guards, faced with what appeared to be legitimate Roman authority, were uncertain how to respond. They had been trained to protect the sanctuary, but they had also been taught to respect Roman law. The confusion of the moment was exactly what the assassins had counted on. Arsinoe, seeing the armed men approaching, understood immediately what was happening. She had lived with the expectation of death for so long that its actual arrival was almost a relief. But she was determined to face it with the dignity that had characterized her entire life. She rose from her knees, straightened her shoulders, and looked directly at the men who had come to kill her. In that moment, she was every inch the queen she had always claimed to be. The confrontation that followed was brief but dramatic. Megabyzus stepped forward, his voice shaking with age and outrage, demanding that the assassins respect the sanctuary of the temple. The worshippers who were present began to realize what was happening, and several of them tried to intervene. But the Roman agents had come prepared for resistance. They had orders to complete their mission regardless of the consequences, and they were not about to be deterred by the protests of priests and pilgrims. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most shocking violations of religious law in ancient history. The assassins seized Arsinoe despite the protests of the temple officials and the screams of the worshippers. They dragged her from the inner sanctuary, past the altar where she had prayed for the last time, through the great hall where pilgrims had come to seek the goddess's blessing for centuries. Her dignity never wavered. Even as they pulled her toward the temple steps, she walked with her head high, her expression composed, looking every inch the royal blood that flowed in her veins. The execution took place on the steps of the Temple of Artemis, in full view of the horrified crowd that had gathered. The method was swift, a soldier's sword thrust that ended her life in moments. But the symbolic impact was enormous. Here, on the steps of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, In the shadow of a temple dedicated to the goddess who protected women and children, a young woman was murdered for the crime of being an inconvenience to her sister's ambitions. The blood that flowed down the marble steps that day would stain more than just the stone. It would stain the reputations of everyone involved in the assassination, marking them as people who had placed political expediency above the most sacred laws of gods and men. The violation of temple sanctuary was not just a crime against Arsinoe, it was a crime against the very foundations of civilized society, an act that shocked even the callous sensibilities of the ancient world. As news of the assassination spread throughout the Mediterranean, the reaction was swift and overwhelmingly negative. Even those who had supported Cleopatra's rule were horrified by the violation of religious sanctuary. The priests of temples throughout the region condemned the act, calling down divine curses on those responsible. Local officials who had previously been cooperative with Roman authority began to distance themselves from the perpetrators. The execution had accomplished its immediate political goal. Arsinoe was dead, and the threat she represented was eliminated. But the cost in terms of reputation and moral authority was enormous. The assassination of Arsinoe IV marked a turning point in the relationship between Cleopatra and Antony. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, committed an act that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The young woman who had once brought Julius Caesar to the brink of defeat, who had shown such courage in the face of overwhelming odds, who had maintained her dignity even in captivity and exile, was gone. But her death would not bring the security that Cleopatra had hoped for. Instead, it would become one more weight on the scales of judgment that would eventually tip against both lovers in their final confrontation with Octavian. The Temple of Artemis, meanwhile, was forever changed by what had happened on its sacred steps. The priests performed elaborate purification rituals, trying to cleanse the sanctuary of the pollution caused by the murder. But some stains can never be washed away, and the temple would carry the memory of that violation until its own destruction centuries later. The goddess herself, if she existed, had been powerless to protect the young woman who had sought her sanctuary. The age of the gods was ending, and the age of pure political power was beginning. The news of Arsinoe's assassination spread across the Mediterranean like wildfire, carried by merchants, diplomats, and travelers who had witnessed the shocking violation of sacred law. In Rome, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Even senators who had grown accustomed to the brutal realities of civil war found themselves disturbed by reports of what had happened at Ephesus. This wasn't just another political execution. It was the desecration of one of the most sacred places in the ancient world, an act that challenged the very foundations of religious authority that held their civilization together. The violation of temple sanctuary was not merely a religious crime, but a political miscalculation of staggering proportions. Throughout the ancient world, temples served as neutral ground where even the most bitter enemies could find temporary safety. Kings and commoners alike understood that certain boundaries could not be crossed without inviting divine retribution and human condemnation. By ordering Arsinoe's death in such a sacred place, Antony and Cleopatra had shattered an unspoken contract that had governed Mediterranean politics for centuries. The immediate aftermath of the assassination created ripple effects that neither Antony nor Cleopatra had anticipated. The high priest Megabyzus, devastated by his failure to protect the young woman who had become like a daughter to him, sent messengers to temples throughout the region, calling for a religious boycott of anyone connected to the murder. This wasn't mere symbolic protest, it was economic warfare. The temples controlled vast networks of trade and finance, and their disapproval could make life extremely difficult for merchants and officials who depended on their services. More dangerous still were the political implications. Octavian, Antony's rival in Rome, seized upon the assassination as evidence of his opponent's moral corruption and unfitness for leadership. He commissioned orators to spread the story throughout Italy, emphasizing not just the violation of religious law but the disturbing image of a Roman general taking orders from a foreign queen. The propaganda was devastatingly effective. It portrayed Antony as a man who had abandoned Roman values in favor of Eastern decadence, who had become the puppet of a woman who thought nothing of murdering her own sister. The story of Arsinoe's death became a cornerstone of Octavian's campaign to turn Roman public opinion against Antony. Professional storytellers in Rome's taverns and marketplaces began recounting the tale with increasingly dramatic embellishments. They described the young queen's final moments in heartbreaking detail, emphasizing her dignity in the face of death and the shocking violation of divine law. They painted vivid pictures of the goddess Artemis weeping for her murdered devotee, of the temple steps running red with innocent blood, of the very stones crying out for vengeance. These stories found a receptive audience among Romans who were already uncomfortable with Antony's relationship with Cleopatra. The traditional Roman virtues of duty, honor, and respect for the gods seemed to be embodied by the murdered princess, while Antony and Cleopatra represented everything that was foreign, decadent, and threatening to Roman identity. The assassination became a symbol of the choice facing Rome, between the ancient values that had made them great and the corrupting influence of Eastern luxury and power. But the damage extended far beyond Roman politics. Throughout the Greek cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, local officials who had previously cooperated with Roman authority began to reconsider their positions. The murder of Arsinoe had demonstrated that Roman power recognized no limits, not even the sacred boundaries that had been respected for centuries. If a princess under the protection of Artemis herself could be dragged from sanctuary and murdered, what safety could any of them expect? The psychological impact on Cleopatra herself was perhaps the most profound consequence of the assassination. She had achieved her immediate goal, the elimination of a rival who threatened her legitimacy, but the cost in terms of her own self-image was enormous. Cleopatra had always seen herself as the inheritor of Alexander's legacy, a ruler who combined Greek intellectual sophistication with Egyptian divine authority. The murder of her sister forced her to confront the reality that she had become something else entirely, a tyrant who would sacrifice family bonds and religious law to maintain power. The relationship between Cleopatra and Antony began to change in subtle but significant ways following the assassination. The act that was supposed to strengthen their partnership by eliminating a common threat had instead created new tensions between them. Antony found himself increasingly isolated from his Roman supporters, many of whom were horrified by his role in violating temple sanctuary. Cleopatra, meanwhile, discovered that the security she had sought through murder was largely illusory. New rivals and threats emerged to replace the one she had eliminated. The children that Antony and Cleopatra had together would grow up in the shadow of their parents' crime. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were raised in a court where the memory of their murdered aunt haunted every family gathering. They learned early that survival in their world required not just intelligence and ambition, but the willingness to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The lessons of Arsinoe's death became part of their education in the brutal realities of royal power. The assassination also had profound implications for the broader question of Egyptian independence. Arsinoe had represented something that died with her, the possibility of a truly independent Egypt, free from Roman interference and internal strife. Her death marked the end of the last serious challenge to Cleopatra's Roman-backed rule and the beginning of Egypt's final transformation into a Roman dependency. The dream of restoring the ancient glory of the pharaohs died on the steps of the Temple of Artemis, along with the young woman who had embodied it. The religious community throughout the Mediterranean struggled to make sense of what had happened. If the gods could not protect their own devoted servants in their own sacred spaces, what did that say about divine power in an age of Roman dominance? Some priests began to preach that the old gods were withdrawing from a world that had become too corrupt for their presence. Others argued that the violation of sanctuary was a test of faith, that the truly righteous would be rewarded in the afterlife even if they suffered in this one. The Temple of Artemis itself became a place of pilgrimage for those who mourned Arsinoe's death. Visitors would climb the blood-stained steps where she had died, leaving flowers and small offerings in her memory. The priests, initially uncomfortable with this unauthorized cult, gradually came to accept it as a natural expression of grief and outrage. They began to speak of Arsinoe as a martyr, a pure soul who had been sacrificed to the political ambitions of lesser mortals. The assassination created a new category of political crime in the ancient world, the violation of religious sanctuary for political purposes. Previous rulers had occasionally committed such acts, but never with such public attention and international condemnation. The murder of Arsinoe became a precedent that would be remembered and cited for centuries whenever ambitious politicians considered similar actions. It served as a warning that some boundaries once crossed could never be recrossed. The impact on the broader Roman civil war was equally significant. The assassination gave Octavian powerful propaganda material that he used to great effect in his struggle against Antony. He portrayed himself as the defender of Roman values against Eastern corruption, the upholder of religious law against those who would violate the most sacred traditions. The contrast between his careful respect for traditional Roman piety and Antony's willingness to desecrate foreign temples became a central theme of his campaign. The story of Arsinoe's death also began to influence how Romans thought about their empire and their relationship with the peoples they conquered. The assassination demonstrated that Roman power was not just political and military, but also moral and religious. It showed that Rome's expansion was not just about territory and tribute, but about the fundamental transformation of the societies they controlled. The violation of the Temple of Artemis marked a new phase in Roman imperialism, one in which even the most sacred traditions of subject peoples could be swept aside in the name of political necessity. For the surviving members of the Ptolemaic family, the assassination served as a final warning about the price of opposition to Roman authority. Cleopatra's younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who had been co-ruler with her until his convenient death in 44 BC, was widely believed to have been poisoned on her orders. The murder of Arsinoe confirmed that the last queen of Egypt would tolerate no rivals, no matter how closely related they might be. The ancient Ptolemaic tradition of sibling murder had reached its logical conclusion. The economic consequences of the assassination were felt throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The religious boycott organized by the priests of Artemis disrupted trade networks that had operated for centuries. Merchants who had previously relied on temple-guaranteed safe passage found themselves facing new obstacles and expenses. The uncertainty created by the violation of sanctuary made all commercial relationships more precarious, as traders wondered what other traditional protections might be swept away by political ambition. The assassination also had profound implications for the role of women in ancient politics. Arsinoe had represented a different model of female leadership, one based on personal courage and political independence, rather than sexual alliance with powerful men. Her death eliminated an alternative that might have inspired other women to seek power through their own achievements rather than through their relationships with male patrons. The murder reinforced the message that women who challenged the established order would be destroyed, regardless of their talents or legitimacy. The psychological trauma inflicted on the witnesses to the assassination cannot be underestimated. The pilgrims, priests, and temple servants who saw Arsinoe dragged from sanctuary and murdered were left with images that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Many reported nightmares and anxiety attacks in the weeks following the event. Some left the priesthood entirely, unable to reconcile their faith in divine protection with the reality of what they had witnessed. The assassination created a new category of martyrdom in the ancient world: death for the crime of representing an alternative to established power. Arsinoe had not died fighting in battle or leading a rebellion. She had died while serving as a priestess, pursuing a life of religious contemplation and scholarly study. Her murder demonstrated that even the most peaceful forms of political opposition would be met with deadly force by those who felt threatened by them. The international ramifications of the assassination extended far beyond the immediate political situation. Kingdoms and city-states throughout the Mediterranean began to reconsider their relationships with Rome in light of what had happened at Ephesus. The violation of temple sanctuary suggested that Roman power recognized no limits, that even the most sacred traditions could be swept aside when they proved inconvenient. This realization forced many rulers to confront the uncomfortable reality that their independence was largely illusory. The assassination also marked a turning point in the relationship between political power and religious authority in the ancient world. The murder of Arsinoe demonstrated that secular rulers were prepared to violate the most sacred laws when their political interests demanded it. This precedent would be remembered and cited for centuries, contributing to the gradual erosion of religious authority that characterized the late Roman Republic and early empire. The story of Arsinoe's death became a cautionary tale about the price of political ambition and the dangers of unlimited power. It showed how the pursuit of security through violence ultimately created new insecurities, how the elimination of rivals through murder generated new enemies, and how the violation of moral boundaries in the name of political necessity ultimately undermined the very foundations of legitimate authority. The assassination represented the triumph of realpolitik over traditional values, of immediate advantage over long-term consequences, of personal ambition over public good. It showed how the ancient world's most sophisticated rulers could be driven to acts of shocking brutality by their fears and insecurities. The murder of Arsinoe was not just a crime against an individual, it was a crime against the very idea that there were limits to what those in power could do to maintain their positions. The blood that flowed down the marble steps of the Temple of Artemis that day would stain more than just the stone. It would mark the beginning of a new era in Mediterranean politics, one in which the old certainties about divine protection and moral limits would be swept away by the ruthless pursuit of power. The age of the gods was ending, and the age of pure political calculation was beginning. The death of Arsinoe IV was both a symptom and a cause of this transformation, a moment when the ancient world crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The legacy of that terrible morning would echo through the centuries, a reminder of what happens when those who hold power decide that no law, divine or human, can be allowed to stand in the way of their ambitions. The young woman who had once brought Julius Caesar to the brink of defeat, who had shown such courage in the face of overwhelming odds, who had maintained her dignity even in captivity and exile, was gone. But her death would not bring the security that Cleopatra had hoped for. Instead, it would become one more weight on the scales of judgment that would eventually tip against both lovers in their final confrontation with destiny. The moral weight of what had been done settled over the ancient world like a shroud. In Alexandria, Cleopatra found herself staring at her reflection in polished bronze mirrors, searching for signs of the sister she had condemned to death. The face that looked back at her was still beautiful, still regal, but there was something different now. A hardness around the eyes, a tightness to the mouth that spoke of lines crossed and souls compromised. She had achieved her goal of eliminating the last threat to her throne, but victory tasted like ashes in her mouth. The nightmares began almost immediately, and Cleopatra would wake in the pre-dawn darkness, her silk sheets soaked with sweat, the image of Arsinoe's face burning behind her closed eyelids. In her dreams, her sister appeared not as the political rival she had become, but as the young girl she had once been, bright-eyed and eager, following her older sister through the marble corridors of the palace, hanging on every word with the devotion only a child can offer. The guilt was a living thing, gnawing at her insides like a parasite that fed on remorse. Antony, meanwhile, discovered that ordering the violation of sacred sanctuary had consequences that extended far beyond immediate political advantage. His officers began to look at him differently, their eyes holding a mixture of fear and revulsion that he had never seen before. These were hardened soldiers who had witnessed the worst brutalities of civil war, men who had executed prisoners and sacked cities without hesitation. But something about the murder of a young woman in a temple had shaken them to their core. The propaganda war that followed was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Octavian's agents didn't just spread word of the assassination, they transformed it into a story of mythic proportions. They commissioned poets to write verses about the innocent princess murdered by her jealous sister, playwrights to create dramas depicting the violation of divine law, and artists to paint frescoes showing Artemis weeping over her fallen devotee. The image of Arsinoe's blood staining the sacred steps became a symbol of everything that was wrong with Antony and Cleopatra's rule. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the way the assassination changed public perception of Cleopatra herself. She had spent years crafting an image as the reincarnation of Isis, the loving mother goddess who protected her people. The murder of her sister shattered that carefully constructed persona, revealing the calculating politician beneath the divine facade. People began to whisper that if she could kill her own blood, what would she do to those who were nothing more than subjects? The fear that settled over Egypt was palpable, a collective holding of breath as an entire nation waited to see what their queen might do next. The international community reacted with a mixture of horror and strategic calculation. Smaller kingdoms that had been considering alliances with Antony and Cleopatra suddenly found reasons to delay their negotiations. The violation of temple sanctuary had demonstrated that these rulers recognized no limits to their power, that even the most sacred traditions could be swept aside when they proved inconvenient. Who would want to trust their fate to people capable of such acts? The priests of Artemis, led by the grieving Megabyzus, began what amounted to a religious crusade against the perpetrators. They sent messages to temples throughout the Mediterranean, calling for prayers and curses to be directed against those who had violated their sanctuary. The power of coordinated religious opposition was not something to be taken lightly in the ancient world. These priests controlled vast networks of information and influence, and their condemnation could make life extremely difficult for anyone who had earned their displeasure. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for generations suddenly became fraught with complications. Merchants who had relied on temple-guaranteed safe passage found themselves facing new obstacles and expenses. The uncertainty created by the violation of sanctuary made all commercial relationships more precarious, as traders wondered what other traditional protections might be swept away by political ambition. In Rome, the assassination became a central theme in the growing conflict between Antony and Octavian. The future Augustus understood the power of moral authority in politics, and he wielded the story of Arsinoe's death like a weapon. He portrayed himself as the defender of Roman values against Eastern corruption, the upholder of religious law against those who would violate the most sacred traditions. The contrast between his careful respect for traditional Roman piety and Antony's willingness to desecrate foreign temples became a cornerstone of his propaganda campaign. The psychological impact on Cleopatra's surviving children was profound and lasting. They grew up in a palace where the memory of their murdered aunt haunted every family gathering. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus learned early that survival in their world required not just intelligence and ambition, but the willingness to destroy anyone who stood in their way. The lessons of Arsinoe's death became part of their education in the brutal realities of royal power. The assassination also marked the end of something precious in the ancient world, the belief that there were limits to what those in power could do. The violation of temple sanctuary had been more than just a crime against one individual. It had been an attack on the very idea that divine law could constrain human ambition. The murder of Arsinoe represented a crossing of the Rubicon in moral terms, a point of no return that would haunt the perpetrators for the rest of their lives. As the years passed, the story of Arsinoe's death took on a life of its own. It became a cautionary tale told by mothers to their daughters, a warning about the dangers of ambition without conscience. Philosophers debated its meaning, historians recorded its details, and poets transformed it into verse that would be remembered long after the political circumstances that created it had been forgotten. The young woman who had died on the steps of the Temple of Artemis became immortal in a way that her killers never would be. The final irony was that the security Cleopatra had sought through murder proved to be largely illusory. New threats emerged to replace the ones she had eliminated, and the moral authority she had sacrificed in the process proved to be more valuable than any political advantage she had gained. The assassination had solved an immediate problem while creating long-term consequences that would ultimately contribute to her own downfall. When Antony and Cleopatra finally faced their last battle at Actium in 31 BC, the memory of Arsinoe's death hung over them like a curse. The violation of temple sanctuary had cost them allies, undermined their moral authority, and provided their enemies with powerful propaganda material. The young woman who had died 7 years earlier had achieved a kind of posthumous victory, as her death became one of the factors that led to the destruction of those who had ordered her murder. The story of Arsinoe IV reminds us that history is not just about the grand movements of armies and the rise and fall of empires, but about the individual human costs of political ambition. It shows us how the pursuit of power can corrupt even the most sophisticated rulers, how the elimination of rivals through violence ultimately creates new enemies, and how the violation of moral boundaries in the name of political necessity can undermine the very foundations of legitimate authority. The blood that flowed down the marble steps of the Temple of Artemis that day in 41 BC would stain more than just the stone. It would mark the beginning of a new era in Mediterranean politics, one in which the old certainties about divine protection and moral limits would be swept away by the ruthless pursuit of power. The age of the gods was ending, and the age of pure political calculation was beginning. The death of Arsinoe IV was both a symptom and a cause of this transformation, a moment when the ancient world crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. In the end, the young woman who had once brought Julius Caesar to the brink of defeat, who had shown such courage in the face of overwhelming odds, who had maintained her dignity even in captivity and exile, had achieved a kind of immortality through her death. Her story serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the courage to face injustice with dignity, and that the most powerful legacies are often written in blood on the steps of temples where the innocent go to pray.